Right now, in the United States Senate, lawmakers are arguing over something called the Save America Act, which, to be fair, is kind of an awesome name. You'd never know it was a voting reform bill. It sounds more like a patriotic action movie where Bruce Willis punches literal voter fraud in the face before blowing up the elementary school gym in the name of election integrity. But the reality is much more complicated. The Save America Act is the single most contentious piece of legislation to land on the Senate floor this year, one on which both sides are expending tremendous amounts of political capital. Supporters say it protects elections. Critics say it suppresses voters. And because this is modern politics, some observers think the entire fight might also be about political distraction and strategic messaging. What's the real truth? Well, that's for you to decide, because today we're breaking down what the bill does, why supporters say it's necessary, why opponents say it's dangerous, and what political incentives might actually be driving the fight. Because in Washington, legislation is rarely just legislation. Sometimes it's policy, sometimes it's politics, and sometimes it's both, wearing a fake mustache. Let's figure this out. The Save America Act would require Americans registering to vote in federal elections to provide documentary proof of American citizenship. That means things like passports, birth certificates, and naturalization documents. It would also require presentation of voter ID at the time of voting. So, if passed, the law would prevent states from accepting voter registrations without verifying citizenship documentation, and keep anyone who was unable to prove citizenship from casting a ballot in federal elections. Supporters say the goal is simple: protect the integrity of American elections. Opponents say the consequences could be significant because millions of Americans don't have those documents readily available. But before we get into the debate, let's start with the central question. The bill is designed to prevent non-citizens from voting. So, is non-citizen voting a real problem? Under U.S. federal law, non-citizens are already prohibited from voting in federal elections. The ban applies to presidential, congressional, and most state elections. Violations can lead to fines, prison, or deportation. So the short answer is that non-citizen voting in U.S. elections is already illegal and appears to be extremely rare. That's according to most academic research, state audits, and dedicated investigations that have pursued this question. However, it does occur occasionally, and the debate largely centers on how serious that risk is and how much policy should respond to it. Multiple studies of election records have consistently shown that confirmed cases of non-citizen voting are incredibly small compared with total ballots cast. For example, after the 2016 election, officials in 49 states and Washington, D.C. reported only 2 possible cases among 137.7 million ballots cast. That number is positively infinitesimal. A national investigation of voter fraud cases from 2000 to 2012 found 56 alleged instances of non-citizen voting in total during that time frame, which means that even if all 56 allegations were true, they would represent roughly 0.00004% of all votes cast. To put that in perspective, that would be 4 votes out of every 10 million ballots. Many state reviews have found 0 confirmed cases of non-citizen voting in specific elections. So, the available evidence would seem to conclude that non-citizen voting does occasionally happen, but also that verified cases are extremely rare compared with total votes cast, and that the research generally finds isolated incidents rather than widespread systemic fraud. The political debate is less about whether it occurs at all and more about how much policy should respond to a very small number of cases. But hold on. Supporters of the bill don't agree. They argue that non-citizen voting may be undetected, and in fairness, it's not the easiest thing to measure. There is no single national database tracking non-citizen voting cases. Elections are run by states and counties, which means that investigations happen locally and reporting methods vary. Because of that, researchers generally rely on state audits, prosecutions, and court cases to estimate how often it happens. But administrative systems may miss cases, and close elections mean even small numbers could matter. So, from that perspective, policies like the Save America Act are meant to prevent vulnerabilities before they become larger problems. So, for some of us, it isn't just about numbers. It's about confidence in elections, particularly after the 2020 presidential election triggered the intense national debate about election integrity that has been with us ever since. Basically, America is in that stage of a relationship where one partner says, "I trust you," and the other partner says, "Then why are you checking my phone all the time?" Supporters argue the bill is about protecting democracy. Their central claim is that elections should only be decided by citizens, a claim which is correct. The idea is summarized by one simple statement. American citizens, and only American citizens, should decide American elections. To them, requiring documentation is simply common sense. After all, Americans already need ID for many everyday activities like boarding airplanes, opening bank accounts, and buying alcohol. So the thought here is, ID is already required and accepted when it comes to all these other things that American citizens do every day. Why shouldn't something as important as voting require proof of eligibility? Some American lawmakers have framed the bill as essential for rebuilding trust. They frame confidence in elections as the foundation of democracy. So, from this perspective, even rare vulnerabilities should be addressed. Because if voters don't trust elections, the entire system begins to erode. In politics, perception matters. If your voters think the system is broken, you don't just sit there and say, "Relax, relax." You propose legislation with a name like Save America, because if there's one thing Americans trust, it's a bill that sounds like a superhero. Critics of the bill argue that stricter registration requirements may disproportionately affect groups that have already experienced barriers to voting. Groups like younger voters, lower-income Americans, people who move frequently, and people without passports. Those are groups that tend to lean Democratic, so it's not a surprise that Democrats argue the bill could subtly reshape the electorate. And the most animated Democrats take it a step further to argue that's the whole point. But supporters reject that characterization. They argue the goal is verification, not exclusion. Opponents argue the bill could make voting harder for legitimate citizens. One of the most direct criticisms came from Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, who warns us, "Don't let the name of this bill fool you. It would make it harder for millions of Americans to vote." Their argument centers on documentation access, because not everyone has easy access to citizenship documents. Consider situations like elderly voters who never needed passports, citizens whose names changed after they got married, or people who lost documents decades ago. Opponents argue these bureaucratic hurdles could discourage or block participation. And in a democracy, they say the system should do everything it can to make voting easier, not harder. You could make a small argument that America already makes voting a little more complicated than it needs to be. Think about it. There's a whole process you have to go through. First, you have to register to vote. You have to identify where your polling location is. You might have to get time off work just to cast a ballot. Stand in line. Avoid the goods from the bake sale. And also, try not to accidentally vote in a middle school gym during dodgeball practice. Now we're adding document scavenger hunts? Say what you will, but democracy shouldn't feel like a side quest in The Legend of Zelda. Critics also argue the law addresses a problem that data suggests is extremely rare. From their perspective, sweeping restrictions are unnecessary. Instead, they argue the bill risks solving a problem that doesn't meaningfully exist. Now, here's where the debate gets even more political. Because if you read between the lines, the push for this legislation might serve strategic purposes beyond election policy. It could be meant to shift media attention away from other issues dominating the headlines. It's not hard to surmise that Republicans have political incentives for putting so much focus on the Save America Act right now. Incentives that go beyond election security. It's a bright, shiny object they can use to distract from voter concerns with issues like the Iran war, the handling of the Epstein files, and the economy. And it certainly helps Republicans mobilize voters who are still skeptical about the 2020 election. I think it's overstated when compared to the economy, but there's no doubt that election integrity is still a very powerful motivating issue for the Republican base. So, supporting strict voting rules is a signal that lawmakers are taking those concerns seriously. Because when it comes to their own voters, they'd be stupid not to. Putting all their eggs in the election security basket is a win-win for them. With the midterm elections just months away, they get to frame it as a timely, relevant issue that must supersede all other issues, including the inconvenient ones they really don't want to talk about. Because who wants to look like they're against free and fair elections? Arresting a cabal of pedophiles that have taken global control of our institutions? No thanks. We're about election security right now. In Washington, nothing distracts from a scandal quite like a brand new argument. It's the political equivalent of yelling, "Look, look, a bald eagle!" and hoping everyone forgets the unfinished paperwork you left on your desk. And Republicans aren't the only ones under suspicion of an ulterior motive, because supporters of the bill have gone out of their way to raise the opposite suspicion. They argue Democrats are resisting strict voter verification because it might expose instances of improper registrations or administrative errors, and that in doing so, it will bring down their whole house of cards. Republicans say that the Democrats' power base relies on endless illegal immigration and non-citizen voting, meaning there's no greater threat to how Democrats do business than the Save America Act. The loudest voices claim strict verification will reveal non-citizen voting has been happening for decades in numbers so large that all election results are tainted unless the bill passes. Again, documented cases remain extremely rare. But politically, the argument resonates with voters who already worry about election security, because voter ID is a concept that has overwhelming support in the general electorate, not just with Republican voters, but clear majorities of independents and even Democrats. So it puts Democratic politicians in the extremely awkward position of looking like legalized cheating is the only way they have to win. Voter ID? We don't want that. No, we're not cheating. We're just against the one thing that could conclusively prove that we aren't cheating. Ironically, both parties benefit politically from the fight itself. Republicans get to campaign on election security. Democrats get to campaign on voting rights. Both messages energize their bases. And the bill's chances in the Senate are worse than a snowball's chance in hell, because legislation typically requires 60 votes to overcome a filibuster, and Majority Leader Thune has already refused to enact the so-called talking filibuster, which means Democrats ultimately decide the result here. The debate itself may matter more politically than the actual outcome. In Washington, a bill doesn't have to pass to be useful. It just has to become a campaign ad. So, what is the Save America Act really about? That depends on who you ask. Supporters say it protects election integrity. Opponents say it suppresses voters. And political cynics say it's another chapter in Washington's favorite blood sport, arguing about democracy without actually getting anything done. The deeper issue here is trust. Trust in elections, trust in institutions, trust that the rules aren't being rewritten for political advantage. Until that trust returns, every election reform debate will feel like a battle for the future of democracy. Here's the uncomfortable truth about debates like this. Most Americans don't spend their nights reading obsessively through the finer points of election law. They internalize what gets regurgitated to them by their respective echo chambers and use that for the basis of their understanding. They don't comprehend the labyrinth of procedural rules that govern every move Congress makes. They latch onto exclamatory terms and ideas like kill the filibuster or Jim Crow 2.0 and get caught in the riptide of sensationalist language. But what both sides do understand and truly care about is something much simpler. They want to believe that when they vote, it counts. Not more, not less. Just counts. But when every election becomes a battle over the rules themselves, something deeper starts to erode, and that is trust. After the 2020 presidential election, that trust took a serious hit. For some Americans, the fear is that elections aren't secure. For others, the fear is that voting rights are being gutted. Two different fears, but they both come from the same place, a belief that the system might not be fair anymore. And democracy cannot survive long if half the country believes the game is rigged. It just can't. Not because democracy is fragile, but because democracy depends on something invisible. Not laws, not ballots, not even institutions. It depends on belief. The belief that rules apply to everyone. The belief that losing an election doesn't mean losing your voice. And the belief that the system still belongs to all of us. That belief is the real infrastructure of democracy. Once it cracks, everything else becomes harder to hold together. And we're seeing that process play out in real time, year after year, election after election. The country where both sides could disagree on what the future should look like, but still have implicit trust in the integrity and fairness of the elections that decide that future, no longer exists. In its place, we have candidates who refuse to concede, political parties that embrace gerrymandering to maximum effect, and an electorate bent on punishing their perceived political enemies, Republicans and Democrats alike, all in the name of saving democracy. So the debate over the Save America Act isn't just about paperwork or voter rolls. It's about something much bigger. It's about whether Americans can still agree on the rules of the game. Because if we can't agree on the rules, we're not arguing about elections anymore. We're arguing about the future of the country itself. And that's a debate no law, no matter what it's called, can solve on its own.